I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm sure a few more people will roll in, but in the essence of time, we've got a lot to cover, so I want to go through it and make sure we get to the end and have time to take some questions in the chat box. So as I understand it, if you guys have questions as I'm going through, just put them in the chat box. And either kind of Craig will triage those for me, or I'll be able to look at them myself and try to answer a few questions. So a lot to cover in 2 hours. This is the Leadership in Ending Homelessness webinar for the Texas Balance of State. COC for the fine folks at the Texas Homeless Network. I am, if you were wondering, bear with me here, Zach Brown. So I'll tell you a few things about myself. I am the Executive Director of the West Virginia Coalition to End Homelessness. That's my day job. We're a Balance of State COC. We're also the state coalition. We cover 44 counties in West Virginia out of the total of 55. We're also the HMIS for the Balance of State COC in West Virginia. And we're also a direct service provider. We do rapid rehousing, street outreach. We run our coordinated entry centralized intake process, and we recently inherited a permanent supportive housing project. So that's my day job. We have a staff of about 15 people here at this point, steadily growing. I am coming to you live from the offices of the West Virginia Coalition to End Homelessness. So if you hear sort of normal officey noise in the background, I apologize, but I've made everyone be super quiet, or they will get my wrath after the presentation, which they really won't really. That's just a leadership joke. So that's my day job. My sort of moonlighting or side job is I'm what they call a part-time bench player with OrgCode Consulting. Some of you may have seen me present when I've been in Texas. I'm kind of the Texas point guy to some degree for OrgCode, particularly in the Balance of State. So I've been there a few times, done some presentations, and I do stuff like this all the time, and also work on other kind of specific OrgCode projects. So OrgCode Consulting, if you don't know, they're the inventors of the VI SPDAT suite of products and the full SPDAT suite of products. My consulting boss is Mr. Ian DeYoung, if you've ever had the pleasure of meeting him. So I'm at no loss of things to do and don't get very bored very often. So a couple notes in terms of housekeeping stuff. Those are Twitter handles, so I kept it pretty simple. At OrgCode is OrgCode's Twitter handle. Mine is at @ZThomasBrown because go figure, Zach Brown was already taken. Don't know why, but that's what that is. So also, if we don't get to cover all questions or something is confusing to you, please jot down that my email for OrgCode is zbrown@orgcode.com. And the website for OrgCode is, as you may have guessed, orgcode.com. So we're going to launch right into it. First of all, I'd be kind of remiss if I don't bring up the fact that, geez Louise, Texas, you've had a rough year of it. And I hate that for you guys. Texas is one of my favorite places to do work, one of my favorite places to visit. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on this webinar with you, but I really do enjoy Texas. The folks have been nothing but welcoming and kind and accepting every time I visited. So I always walk away from your state when I come back home feeling better than before I left. So when bad things happen to you guys as a state, it bothers me, and I can't stand it for you. So I'll just put that out there right from the get-go. So on to the shameless plug. So a 2-hour webinar seems like a lot, but really I'm just skimming the surface of what Ian does at the OrgCode Leadership Academy on Ending Homelessness. So we have sort of several series of leadership academies on ending homelessness. We have what we call the regular OrgCode Leadership Academy on Ending Homelessness that happens here in West Virginia at a beautiful place called Stonewall Resort, just south of where I'm standing now. And in 2018, that's going to happen on October 23rd, 24th, and 25th. So if you want to save the date for that, if you've never been to Leadership Academy, then that's it's an awesome 2.5-day kind of journey through kind of the deep weeds of how we get better at kind of leading people in the charge to end homelessness. After that, we have a master class that we hold pretty much every year in Scottsdale, Arizona, for the folks who have graduated from the first leadership academy going on to the second one. We've had some specific leadership academies crop up in other places. Canada just had one. There's one going on now. I believe it's still going on in Hawaii, which sounds awesome to me, and clearly I'm not there. But so if you want to come for kind of the deeper, more immersive experience and come see West Virginia and what it looks like, and that West Virginia is probably not as scary as you might think it is, then please save the date for that. So shameless plug right there. Don't stress too much about taking notes. I'm going to send out the entire presentation in PDF form to Craig after this, and the folks at THN are going to send it out to you guys. So some of this gets into some heady, detailed territory, so don't sweat it too much. You'll have everything in front of you. Of course, again, if you have any questions as we go through, put them in the chat box, and if we don't cover them all, you can reach out directly to me. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about your journey in being a leader in ending homelessness. The complex tasks and issues that we have to undertake every day, and to point staff and peers and clients towards kind of the same direction. In terms of being an actual leader, a leader is just kind of more than a title, and I'm going to cover that a little bit today. So if you're kind of further down the chain of command in your organization, that doesn't mean that you're not a leader. It doesn't mean that you don't have influence. But we're going to talk a little bit about kind of who are you in that capacity, in that leadership capacity. How do you influence others? How do others influence you? Because we're all working in sort of large, complex systems. How do you influence the systems around you, and how those other systems influence you? So to start with that, we have to get a little personal, and I have to give you kind of in a nutshell, how I view my approach to leadership. And what I think about leadership is it's about creating an environment of safety, which may seem odd to you at the outset, but really what we're trying to do with leadership is we're trying to create teams that can be pointed towards one common goal, navigate the personalities and the issues and the stresses that we have to undertake, and the financial and funding issues. And, you know, in that you have to create an environment where people feel safe and happy and fulfilled in doing the work. We do fairly hard, stressful work, in my opinion. Part of what we need to do, and part of the challenge, is creating an environment where everybody's kind of pointed in one direction, no matter what's going on. Leadership is about, exercising hopeful joy. Hopefulness means worthy endeavors will be difficult and time-consuming and not enjoyable at all times. Joy is the opposite of fear. And this kind of goes back to the first point of creating this environment of safety where, as things get hard, we're still all pointed in the same general direction and supporting each other. Leadership is about growth. Growth equals change. Change sucks. Change is not comfortable for everybody. I am one of those people, I kind of like change, but that's not necessarily the case for everybody who's going to be on your staff or around you. And we deal with a lot of change. Change politically, change from the fiduciary and financial standpoint, change in staff, change in responsibilities. So we're almost always in flux, and you have to kind of accept as a leader, wherever you are in that hierarchy, that change is going to come, and people aren't always going to deal with that well, and some people are going to love it. Leadership is influence and ownership. That influence can be positive and it can be powerful. It can also be devastating, and it can be limiting. It depends on how you use that vehicle of influence and ownership to kind of guide people through what they need to do in a given day, in a given week, in a given year. People choose to follow you, and that's an incredible influence. If they believe in what you believe, then they're going to follow. We're going to talk about some kind of things to do and some kind of things to not do in terms of framing this entirely. So leadership is not hierarchy. And it's talked about that. Titles are hierarchy. You don't have to be at the highest point of the hierarchy, i.e. like an executive director, just to be a leader. You can be a leader at any facet. And also we have different personalities and different skill sets and different folks in the mix who can step up and be leaders during different times. Nothing that we do, in my opinion, in ending homelessness is a static thing. There always is kind of a changing landscape. So people can step up at any given point to be that different kind of leader. Leadership is about providing a gateway. And we're going to talk about this a little bit from the standpoint of the mechanics of kind of hiring staff? Who do we let in? Who comes into the front door to do this work with us? What are kind of our general modes of thinking and our strategies in accepting those people in the front door? And what do we want out of people who are going to do this work with us? So we're going to talk about that. But you are, as a leader, you're the person between kind of the outer world and who comes into the inner circle of your organization. Leadership is getting people aligned to why you do what you do, not just what you are doing or how you're doing it. If people understand why, they will follow you through good and bad. They'll commit to you. So if they have both this idea of safety and belonging, and they understand why you're doing what you do, then they'll follow you, through the joyful times and through the times that suck. And part of the trick is boiling down kind of your why in such a way that people can get behind it and believe in you. And we're going to talk a lot about feelings, not my favorite topic in the world, but necessary nonetheless, and how people kind of are attenuated to latching onto your why based on how they feel about the situation, feel about your mission, and how clearly you're communicating that and how well you're communicating it. So let's talk about the foundations of leadership and the applicability to ending homelessness. You got to think a little bit about who you are. So leadership is developed, it's not discovered. You're not just born being a leader. And we see this as sort of in different facets within the business world and the nonprofit world. And think about right now as we're going through this kind of who first developed leadership in you, or the inkling to be a leader. What is that point? What's that tipping point? Who are the mentors and the folks that kind of gave you that first burst of confidence that you would be able to become some kind of leader? How did they do that? What did they do? Why do you think they did that in the first place? If we can tap into that and think about that, then we can kind of understand where our journey is going to lead us as a leader, things where we need change, things where we need to get better, things we need to start doing or stop doing. But if we back up and we think a little bit about some basic concepts, one of the basic concepts I like is the idea of ownership. And I'm a fan of a book called Extreme Ownership. And Extreme Ownership is a book written by two guys named Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. They're former Navy SEALs. And I tend to be a bit of a military buff. I was not in the military, but I find a lot of interesting stuff come out of folks who, from a leadership standpoint, who have led people in combat. Because I think that from that standpoint, the way that's framed in terms of leadership, the military has some very interesting kind of insights and strategies, and leadership gets tested, as you can imagine, under some of the most extreme conditions. So I like the way that a lot of the folks who refer to kind of the strategies in the military world, how that kind of relates to what we do every day. So quite simply, and these are pretty straightforward, Extreme Ownership has basically 12 principles to it in the book that I like a lot. So this is about the leader must own kind of everything in the world. That's the good and the bad, and taking that extreme ownership of when things go wrong and the things go right. So it's about, I'm talk a lot about not pushing blame on, but having accountability, holding people accountable but not blaming. If something's wrong, ultimately you're responsible. You as the leader, you set the pace, you set the tone, you set the culture of the organization, so you have to own that. That can be challenging sometimes. I think that we enjoy to some degree, or we're hardwired to look at when things go wrong and find something or someone to blame for that. So taking that ownership can be difficult and requires us to set our ego aside, which we'll get into. There are no really bad teams, only bad leaders. It's not what you preach, but it's what you tolerate. So when you think about kind of the concept of who you let through the door, if you are the gateway or you're helming the gateway of who comes to your organization is going to work there, then what's the culture you've set up and what do you tolerate? If somebody is a sort of toxic influence within your team and you've let the wrong person through the door, how do you deal with that? Because you're going to be judged kind of not by what you say and what you preach, but you're going to be judged by your actions and how you deal with problematic situations. We all know times when we've had to deal with that, and that's unpleasant, but it's important because if you're going to keep your team intact, you don't want to sacrifice sacrifice the ideal of the team for one or two people that are going to be toxic to the whole. And we're going to get a little bit into the weeds about that. You have to be a true believer in the mission if you expect others to follow you. We're going to go back to this idea of why and defining your why. And why do you do this? And do you believe in it? So as we go through this, I want you guys to be thinking about kind of what is your why? Like, why do you do this? Why did you get into this? Why do you want to end homelessness? Do you want to end homelessness? If you're not kind of rooted in the fundamental belief system of that this can be done, that it should be done, that we can do it, then that's going to trickle down to everybody else. You set the pace, you set the attitude, you set the culture, and you'll hear me say that a lot. You got to frame your beliefs in such a way that it's going to be clear to other people. Ego clouds and disrupts everything, and leaders have to leave their egos at the door. This is a hard one for a lot of people. It's certainly hard for me. It's one of those issues of thinking about how we go about heaping praise on people, your team, when things go right, and taking the blame when things go wrong as a leader. If we're taking sort of the ultimate responsibility of what happens, we got to think about that. You know, when you're trying to build a bigger building, you don't want to tear down the other buildings to be the biggest building. You want to build the best building you can, as an analogy that I like to look at. Take advice, be open. You don't know everything. Even if you're leading, you know, you have different people with different thought processes on your team. I rely on that a lot because I can get stuck in my own box, my own way of thinking. And anyone here, either when I'm doing consulting work with OrgCode or here within our own office at the Coalition, somebody always looks at things from a different perspective than I do. And I have to value that, and I have to shut up and listen to that as well. So all elements of the team must work together, mutually supporting one another. So, you know, how far is your, let's call it the circle of trust or the circle of safety, how far does that stretch in your organization? Is it just sort of your central core administration, or does it extend out to every facet of your organization? How do we engage with everyone and develop relationships up and down kind of let's call it the chain of command? So how do we know how things are interconnected? Do we have a core administrative body and that's 5 people and that's who you rely on, everybody else is on the outside of that? What kind of message does that send down the line to the rest of the folks? And thinking about how we can readjust that to some degree. Simplify things as much as possible. So that's going to be crucial to your success. We deal with complex issues, but a lot of them have pretty simple, straightforward answers. And I think when we make things complicated and lay that on top of a complicated problem that we're trying to solve, then you've got sort of a nest of complications. Leaders need to prioritize and execute. You got to relax, look around, and make a call. We talk about prioritization a lot in our business, but what about within our own organizations? Are we sending out kind of clear direction about what the vital tasks are, and are we instead falling into what I will call crisis porn or crisis thinking, where everything's a crisis all the time? Are we spending more time thinking about where we're going to head long term, or spending more time putting out fires? And that has kind of an ebb and flow to it, but what are the things that we really need to focus on, and how do we do that? We need to prioritize and execute those things, make decisions. How are we breaking teams down into small, manageable size and decentralizing command? Are we micromanaging? If you're worried about giving the reins over to your staff, then you're probably hiring the wrong people. You know, if you're not hiring the kind of folks that you can trust long-term to operate from a decentralized standpoint, then I think we got to think about the more fundamental issues in your organization versus what's going on there. Leaders must identify kind of clear directives for the team. We work to house people that have no housing. If we could have been gifted with a simpler directive, I'm not sure what it would be. When we get into talking about the why, I'll share with you guys a little bit kind of what our whys are here at the Coalition and what our whys are in OrgCode. And it's pretty basic concepts. And if someone can latch onto those basic concepts, and we have clear directives, then people can get behind that and they can work on their own why. Got to lead down the chain of command, communicating the strategic vision. That goes along with, you know, pulling out that huge circle of safety and trust and communication, letting everybody know, no matter where they are on your kind of business hierarchy, that they're important and that you're there with them. And we're going to talk about a little bit about strategies to really enact that. Leaders must make decisions quickly in uncertain situations. That's, again, part of the idea of safety. You're being looked to make the kind of decisions that lead your organization in the right spot. The things you tolerate, the things you don't, the direction you take, folks. It doesn't mean that you have to be scared of making mistakes, because we're all going to make mistakes. More often than not, when somebody asks me for advice about how to lead organizations, I start out with my mistakes. These are the things I did that I shouldn't have done. Those are important lessons, and we have to be okay with that for everybody, not just for you as a leader, but everybody down the line. And leaders must balance both discipline and freedom. So we have to have structure, because structure sort of creates expectations. At the same time, this goes back to the idea of kind of having a decentralized mindset. If everybody is kind of attenuated to our why we do this, what's the point, then we have to be able to give people the freedom to innovate and take risks and make mistakes and find out better ways of doing things. You're never going to get any progress if you just kind of keep things at a status quo. So you have to have a structure, but you have to be okay and be trusting with your freedom. Again, if you're not, then that goes back to kind of who are we asking to come to the table and work with us on these important issues. Let's talk about the why, because I keep talking about why, but what does that really mean? This comes from a guy named Simon Sinek. That's S-I-N-E-K. And Simon Sinek has done a lot of work on the why. He's sort of the why guy, if you want to look him up. He does a lot better than I do, but we're gonna get through it. So most organizations start from the outside. They're really good at telling you what they do. I am a shelter and I do this. What we do is in homelessness. How we do it is providing access to housing. So they start out with the kind of the what's, and we're really good at the what's. We're really good at the how's. But if we're going to get people to follow us, both in sort of our communities that we're trying to influence, or staff kind of in-house, and the public at large, we have to kind of attenuate to why. Why do you get out of bed each morning and do this? What is the importance of ending homelessness to you? People don't buy into what you do, they buy into why you're doing it. So when we speak from kind of the inside out, figuring out why we're doing this, we're speaking to the behavior processes of the brain. We're pulling people into the belief system of why we do this. Planning is great and strategies are great, but you have to think back to some of the most compelling stuff in history, and why we attenuate to that, or we think about being inspired by that. And when we don't lead with why, and we're just telling people what we do, telling how we do it, they do tell you why, it's often an afterthought, not the primary explanation of the work. So you got to think back to things like Dr. King didn't give the "I have a 6-point plan" speech. He rooted more into our belief system and what could be, and painted a picture of that. And I think that we have the same charge. So moving people to your why and how do we go about doing this? And this is what we call the law of diffusion of innovation. So you start with an idea, like a 10-year plan, a new housing model, or SPDAT, and an inspired leader with the right explanation of why gets you to the tipping point. And that leader can only wait to see what others have done. So we have different types of folks, and this is a little bit complex, but we're going to run through it quickly. Those who lead are going to inspire us, but we're all at kind of different points on this curve of diffusion of innovation. You've got your innovators, you have your early adopters, your early majority, your late majority, and your laggards. Whoops, sorry. How do we think about where this falls into what we're doing in our work? This is both sort of an internal thing in your organization and outside. So, we all know kind of the innovators and the early adopters. We have the people that invent stuff. Ian DeYoung would be a good example at OrgCode of an innovator who designed the VSPDAT, designed the SPDAT. Early adopters. We here at the coalition, I would put us in that category. And that has a lot to do with kind of the way I look at the world. I was going to kind of find the next thing in terms of what would be better, what's going to work better for us. And then kind of the early majority, the folks that wait to see what the early adopters are going to do, and if they fall on their face, and then the early majority kind of then jumps into the fray. So those innovators and those early adopters, they're the big risk takers. The early majority, semi-risk takers, but they're waiting to kind of test the waters first. The late majority are the folks that wait until everybody in the early majority either falls on their face or makes success before they make a decision, and you kind of have the laggards. One of the good, a good analogy for me in our work is that we're still having these discussions and these arguments over kind of housing first and does it work or not. We're dealing with definitely late majority people and most likely laggards, because I think after a decade of doing housing first and seeing that it is working, that becomes kind of a very old, kind of stale argument after a while. Leading with why creates loyalty and inspiration. So you got to think about if you're stuck explaining to people how to end homelessness and what to do in order to achieve it, you're not creating any followers. You're not creating much inspiration. You're just kind of rolling out tasks and saying this is what. You have to create more. You've created more of a schism from that standpoint. You have to reinforce the exact thing not to do if your community wants to end homelessness. So if you tap into the why, you're going to create both loyalty and inspiration. Sometimes if you're one of those innovators or those early adopters, you're going to charge through the first wall with some of the new thought, armed by your why. So for me, kind of the why that we have here at the coalition is that, by any means necessary beyond, going to jail or doing something illegal, we're going to figure out how we get people from the street or from shelters into housing and keep them there. It's very simple. On our worst day, which we have them, where we're fighting and yelling at each other and things are confusing and horrible, most of my staff can tap right into that and tell you why we do what we do. That leads kind of every decision we make. It doesn't matter if it's HMIS or COC stuff or what we do for the average client or how we're conducting outreach or what we're doing with our coordinated intake or all the other buzzwordy things and the things that we're doing in our pod. If this does not help people get from the street or shelter into housing, is it worth us doing? And that's the constant revisit back to the why. And we all believe that here, and we all latch onto that and feed off of that. So you got to think, if you're creating a why, you're creating the reason for why people should follow you in ending homelessness. When people cannot compel people with why, they try other strategies. And this is the kind of stuff that we got to try to stay away from. If people believe your why, it's because they believe what you believe. If people believe your why, they will do whatever you want them to do because they are bought in. If you don't lead with your why, you're naturally inclined to use other not as effective strategies, including threatening to take away funding, manipulating people, undermining them with their other private funders, publicly humiliating people, launching PR campaigns, bargaining with people, threatening employment or position. And this could happen from outside organizations, and we've seen that, or within our own organizations. They're not talking about kind of what we have to do with, say, a prioritization of resources and reallocation and things like that based on performance. I'm talking about kind of arbitrary strong arm tactics to kind of humiliate and threaten people with their funding and their livelihood and everything else. If you don't lead with your why, then it's easy to fall into this trap. And we've all fallen into some of these traps before. I know that I certainly have. That's not inspiration. So shaming and blaming into submission doesn't work. Holding people accountable is leadership. Shaming and blaming is not leadership. Accountability is more work and more effective long term. And if you shame and blame, it's only going to call into question your own behavior. It's going to make you look bad, and it's going to make you look weak from that standpoint. It's better, and we're more apt to buy into the mission and the vision if we can lay things out from the standpoint of the why, not forcing people. If you have to constantly tell people that you're the boss and therefore they need to do this thing, then maybe you're not really the leader. You may be the boss in terms of title, but you're not really the leader. So leaders eat last. It's another Simon Sinek book. It's a great read. It gets into some complex issues and about kind of our hardwired and how kind of chemically we deal with each other as human beings. So leaders eat last, kind of where the phrase comes from, it actually comes from Simon's experience with some of the work he's done with the military. So back to the military theme again. And he talks a lot about how in the military, one thing that they definitely have right is the fact that, and if you think about it, it's very true, they give out medals when somebody sacrifices themselves for the good of everybody else. And oftentimes in business, we do the exact opposite. We give praise and raises and bonuses to people who sacrifice other people for the good of everybody else. So it's a flipped end of things. A good example of that, if we think back to sort of the housing, or better yet, the banking debacle some years ago. So folks at the higher echelons of the banking system sacrificed their staff at the bottom so that they could have bigger salaries and survive as an organization. And that sort of violates an inherent social contract that's sort of hardwired into us. So leaders eat last when he asked one of the high-up generals in the Marine Corps, what makes the Marine Corps different? Why do people want to join the Marine Corps? Why is it so successful, et cetera? He said, because officers eat last. So it's this ideal of, how do I create kind of this circle of safety? How do I put myself out there as a servant to not only people that we're trying to help in terms of ending homelessness, but to my staff as well? That really takes a lot, getting the ego to the side. So when we talk about what that means in that circle of safety, how do we encourage growth, alignment, and belonging within that circle? I mentioned it a little bit ago, but if you think about it within your own organization, who's in that circle of safety? Because whoever's in that circle of safety, they feel belonging and they feel safe with their job. They feel okay about doing whatever they have to do, the best things they can do, putting their best foot forward in terms of ending homelessness. So how far do you extend that circle of safety? Is it a few people? Is it a lot of people? Have they bought into why you're doing it? Does someone feel on the outside of that? Because that's creating fragmentation within your own organization if you don't extend that circle of safety. Why is that? Well, that's because we operate on certain basic chemical, biological principles as people. It just is. A lot of this gets into some interesting stuff about kind of ways tribal societies interact with one another. Because if we really want to frame it in the real way, our organizations, I mean, we spend the majority of our time working, and we're surrounded with people. We're effectively in sort of a tribal mindset. And when we're doing that, we have to think about kind of how we are wired. And kind of what we call the happiness of the chemicals of happiness would be kind of endorphins, serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. And we're going to talk about those. It's not going to be biology class, so I'm not going to belabor it too much. So endorphins. Endorphins is one of the two, what Simon Sinek, or what biologists will call kind of the selfish chemicals. We don't need any kind of outside influence. We can do this on our own, but it's what diminishes our perceptions of pain, keeps us going, doing a workout, or gives it that runner high. If any of you are constant exercisers, you know that kind of feeling. It feels good. It's the kind of thing that when we kind of working towards one goal and we're under sort of duress, it's the thing that gets us through those 70-plus-hour weeks and those backbreaking middle seats and weeks that we all have had where you're planning for the conference and you're getting things done, and keeps us kind of going. Dopamine. So this is the reward for tasks. This is the marking done on the to-do list. It's the stuff that motivates us to achieve incremental goals. So, rewards that motivated behavior. It's a little bit like the greed function of our brain, although that's kind of like the negative way. But when you check that stuff off your to-do list, that's the stuff that you get. You're getting a little hit of dopamine. When like if you're super hungry and you're walking towards the peach tree, and the closer you get, you're gonna have that reward at the end. That's the stuff. That's dopamine. That's what drives you to kind of perform and get done with kind of finite tasks. Serotonin, the big one. This is the big one within organizations. It provides that feeling of significance and pride and status. It's how you want to seek recognition from others. You want to do well for your boss, or we want to make our parents proud, or we want to make our wife proud. This is kind of the leadership chemical. This is the big one. And this is what creates a sense of allegiance and organizational cohesion in most of your organizations. So if you're the kind of leader that's out there, do you deserve to be looked at from the standpoint of, I want to make my boss proud? Are you creating that kind of environment? I would say on any kind of given day, I'll speak for myself, some days I do and some days I don't. Serotonin is the thing that we get when, that's why we kind of publicly recognize people for doing stuff. So when we're social animals, when we get up at a conference, we want to bring up the folks who've done the best job this year, or We want to recognize the folks publicly for long terms of service, and we all do this. It's the whole reason why when we graduate from high school, when we graduate from college, they don't just send you a PDF of your diploma and say, here, great job, here's your PDF, have a wonderful life. We don't do that. We have a lot of pomp and circumstance. We put on the cap, we put on the gown. We in the crowd are the people who are our friends and our family and love us and support us, and we need that. We need that to feel, to be happy and to feel fulfilled. So you've got oxytocin. So this is the thing that creates kind of intimacy, trust, and comes from knowing that someone's going to protect you. So moms and babies and lovers feel this when they're protected and loved, and that's that feeling of safety. It's that thing that happens when you're just sitting and watching TV with your friend, and you don't have to say a thing. It's that thing that happens when you're kind of sitting on the couch with your dog. That's a release of oxytocin. That's that safe feeling. But this is where I think in our world, it segues into what are you actually offering to your staff in terms of appreciation? Beyond just sort of like the monetary rewards and the bonuses and the cost of living raises and the things that we do, you know, they found and research shows that, you know, on one hand, kind of general material rewards will provide kind of one sense of satisfaction, but how much are we providing in terms of giving of our time? Money can be conveyed and seen differently by different people. The value of $1,000 to one person may not be the same value to somebody else, depending on how much money you have and how much importance you put on money. Time is something that we all understand because we're all under the same sort of clock. Time, we all have a limited time on the earth, so it's hardwired in us to think about time as sort of the important commodity. So where I think this kind of dovetails in what we need to do as leaders is, what are those gestures of generosity in understanding? So are we just sending an email all the time to our staff saying, hey, great job, hope you're feeling, you know, great about your day and that you belong here, et cetera? Or are we like walking the 30 feet down the hall to have a conversation? Oxytocin is the reason that, ironically, webinars are worse than being in person, than presenting to people, because you have an interaction. You're giving of your time, you're giving of your emotion, you can see each other's faces. So we're wired to want to look at time and those little gestures of, do I go out with my staff and do outreach occasionally? Do I go out with my staff and do case management occasionally? Do I look into what their world is and show them that with my time, I'm giving it to them to then show my appreciation? So what's the point with all this? Why am I running through the chemicals? Well, you can't trick human nature. You have to look at how you're fostering fulfillment and safety and happiness and appreciation and direction and freedom and that kind of sense of tribe within your own organization. How far are you extending that circle of safety? Because if you extend that circle of safety and you anchor things into your why, people will do a lot of amazing things for you under a lot of amazing circumstances. Because we have to look at it from this standpoint, leadership comes at a cost. So when you're in a position of power, there's expectations. You have to solve the problems. The whole reason why we have hierarchies, and most people don't blanch at the idea of hierarchies. Most people don't care that their boss makes more money than them. The numerical value is not that important. People care when they feel like you don't have their back. People care when it really hits the fan. Are you going to stand up for them? Do they know that you're going to be there for them? Do you have their best interest in your hand? This is why when you rise to points within the hierarchy of having a leadership position, the cost of that is your self-interest, that you're sacrificing kind of your issues and your self-interest for the protection of those people and the guidance of the organization. So you're going to sacrifice yourself in the service of others when the time comes. And that's also something that's sort of hardwired within us. Also, are you a good gatekeeper? Who do you let into your organization? Are you choosing that wisely? Do you pay people in a way that makes them want to be there and get better at what they're doing? Do you give up your time to your staff? And I usually bring up, we have a tendency within our business to kind of look at direct service jobs as entry-level jobs. The simplest, most mundane, and we pay them the worst, and they're down at the bottom. And then when they do well at direct service, then we promote them into some sort of administrative position, and we up their salary and they move them up the hierarchy, when I think personally, and I'm bringing this up a lot, and case managers love when I bring this up, and outreach workers love it when I bring this up, but I think we have it backwards a little bit. So direct service staff, from one standpoint, are doing the thing that we need done. If you're doing outreach, or you're doing PSH case management, or you're an SSVF person, or you're doing HUD-VASH, or you're doing rapid rehousing, then you're out there doing the thing that needs to get done in terms of ending homelessness. So from that standpoint, kind of my little soapbox about that is I try, particularly here in-house with our direct service staff, is try to pay them well. I want them to stay. I want them to enjoy their job. I want them to get good at their job. I want to have some permanency in that. And I want to just move them up into an administrative position and lose that expertise and that knowledge. So both from the standpoint of kind of how are we hiring and how are we paying people and how are we valuing them. Just a quick note on hiring, are we just hiring based on kind of the, what kind of alphabet soup is behind your name? What kind of degree that you have? Are we hiring on that belief system? Are we hiring them in terms of that why? And I tend to do that. I'm a little less concerned about, at least here at the coalition, a little less concerned about kind of the background and the credentials of the individual. And it's not saying that we hire, I'm looking for uncredentialed folks. But what I'm saying is, when I interview folks to come into our organization potentially, as the gatekeeper, I hit them with curveball questions in terms of what they believe, how they feel about homelessness, what are their goals, what's their day, what's their usual day look like, how do they deal with stress, what is kind of their belief system, because I can't fix kind of their general beliefs. I can train them to do lots of things, but I can't go back and kind of reframe them from the standpoint of wanting to do this work. So just a little note about that. So the big one, when we're dealing with people out in our different communities, do people believe in your community, believe in what you believe? Is their why aligned with your why? So you ever wonder why, even with all your hard work, the business community would like a different approach, or even if you're in the helping business and so are they, that you're miles apart from approaches by some faith groups or other nonprofit groups. Even with all your efforts, you can't seem to get elected officials to see things exactly what the issue is and how to solve it. And, if there's a disconnect, there may be a disconnect within your own organization and not even elsewhere in the community. It certainly could be the disconnect between the way they see the world and the way you see the world, particularly in ending homelessness. But consider the impact of two things on leadership and your ability to inspire and influence. The first one is the morality. The other one is sort of the neurobiology, and we talked a little bit about that, about how people act and what they believe. And there are kind of 5 moral foundations of each person. That's harm and care, fairness and reciprocity, your in-group loyalty, your views on authority and respect, and sort of purity and sanctity. I'm going to run through these moral foundations. This is where moral psychology shows kind of exceptional differences are, in-group loyalty, the difference of morality and perspectives of diversity. So this gets into kind of the political realm that kind of the more liberal folks want revolution through like-minded people, while conservatives want order. Authority and respect gets into the difference of morality related to things like rules, reforming to meet expectations of others. So, for instance, we'll put it in liberal and conservative parlance. Liberals want sort of inclusivity for all, and conservative folks tend to want more conformity or somebody to be kind of excluded. And I don't mean to get political. I think probably I have enough of this, but it's a good example. And impurity and sanctity. Differences of morality related to things like drinking and sexual behavior. And you got to think about how, when we look at the outside world and we're dealing with different kinds of people and different kinds of entities, one of the biggest frustrating things we run into is sort of, how do I get them to see the importance of what we're doing? I think for a lot of us, it's already kind of framed because we were drawn to this work because we're wired to do this kind of work, and not everybody can look at it that way. So I think sometimes outside yourself, looking at these issues and figuring out kind of how they're wired and putting yourself in their world a little bit to explain ending homelessness. This is when you get the infamous question and how to figure out the infamous question of, what do you do? So like, I'll have an uncle, like, what is it you guys do? What do you do? And how we go about explaining that. So why is this important? ending homelessness in and of itself is a moral issue because not only has homelessness become moralized, but the perspectives of how to address it are guided by our morals. So a pluralistic society is tolerant of multiple moral matrices. So one dominant identity of what constitutes the best or most virtuous approach to ending homelessness will always be met with sort of difference and defense. So, you know, we create teams based upon morality to advance our perspective in ending homelessness. And that's kind of the flip side to when you're creating your own why, it's coming from your belief system. That can be really powerful. That can be really destructive, depending on kind of where you're coming from. I don't have to tell anybody this because this is kind of what our world and our country looks like right now. We want people to join our team instead of appreciating the differences between the teams. This is one of the biggest, in my mind, one of the biggest kind of leadership challenges. You know, we get lost and we get divided, sort of driven by the division between how I view things and how you view things. The struggle of for and against is the mind's worst disease. And can you kind of step out of that and value people's different perspectives? There's no one on my staff that like entirely believe the same thing from the standpoint of political motivations or morality or anything else. But if we're anchored into the why we do this, you can get around those things. You have to appreciate that diversity. And I think that we have a tendency right now, not to give everyone a lecture on where we are in terms of society, but I think we have a tendency now to say, well, because you disagree with me, I want you to go and disappear. When we get back to these issues of having humility and checking our ego and everything else, I believe certain things and I think I'm right. But it doesn't mean that somebody else who has completely different beliefs that I may disagree with wholeheartedly don't have another perspective on an issue or a problem. So it's trying to be as inclusive as we can and patient and understanding and open-minded about those differences, particularly within a staff, because if not, then you're going to have those divisions. When you have those divisions and cracks creep inside, that echoes into the outside world. And we have enough of a problem to deal with right now in the outside world. So a lot of problems we have to solve will never be solved by I'm right and you're wrong because both think you're right. Can you step out of the battle? And how can we move forward? Well, we have to know about the limbic brain a little bit, and that's the red part. And we have also kind of our reptilian brain, which is the older part of our brain, the instinctual part. Limbic brain is where we feel things. It's where we make decisions. But oddly enough, the limbic brain does not control language. So no wonder I suck at explaining how I feel about people using words. This is where morality puts us in an uncomfortable place. Potentially, we use the language to describe our morality. But we appealing to the limbic system of others allows us to form alliances that feel right. If you can get people to believe your why, then you can get into why this feels right. And this is what's interesting about the limbic brain, and that it controls those chemicals that make you feel things, but at the same time is not hooked into sort of your language center. This is why when something feels right to you, or you get a gut feeling about something, this is where that's important and that has value. Not necessarily in assessing clients, but in kind of in everything else. That's why when you know something just sort of fits, where it's right, or people get to the point where they understand that they have a sense of belonging at a place and it feels good. And sometimes that takes time, but it helps us understand the differences between people and how not necessarily we can't just like get rid of those differences, but how we navigate those. So think a little bit about, do you have what it takes? You know what it takes to lead with your why, and think about what your why is. Hopefully you've sketched out what your why is. And thinking a little bit about your moral foundation and how those influence your perspective. And now you can go into sort of the neurobiology impact, and we've covered kind of the chemicals and what you feel. But do you have the traits and skills to be of a successful leader? Are there things that you need to develop? So traits of successful leaders, they kind of have a typology to them to a degree. You know, over the years, there's basic foundations of what's looked for in leadership assets for the better part of 40 years. They look back and looked at, you know, what makes a decent leader, and how, again, leaders aren't necessarily born. They're developed more often than not, but are you adaptable? What's your social acumen? How do you interact with folks? Are you the kind of person that stays in the back a little bit? Because I am. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Do you have people in your team that can kind of fulfill that void a little bit for you? Are you willing to assume responsibility? Are you assertive when it's necessary? Not necessarily all the time, but are you assertive when you need to be assertive? Are you cooperative? Highly valued in our systems? Are you persistent towards the goal? Does it bother you that we don't make forward progress? Are you impatient when that doesn't happen? And I think that in my anecdotal experience, the largest majority of kind of good leaders I've seen tend to have this sort of constant angsty impatience towards moving on to the next thing and persisting. Particularly important in ending homelessness, because we all know we can go through those dragging times of, geez, this is not moving quickly enough. I don't like this. I can't, make good inroads with the VA, et cetera, et cetera. So are you persistent? Can you peck away at the problem in a persistent manner? Are you dependable? Both to kind of the outside world, are you doing the kind of work that people can look at your organization and say, well, they're getting it done? Also, are you dependable kind of within the organization? Are you a dependable leader in terms of you're going to take care of those things that go wrong? You are going to praise people when things go right. You're going to take the blame for things when they go wrong. Can people look upon you as a dependable person? Are you decisive? No matter what's going on, do you get stuck in sort of like indecisive mode and you don't want to go one way or the other? People are looking to you to lead and make those decisions. Are you achievement oriented? Are you tolerant of stress? And that's kind of a wide one in that we all tolerate stress in different ways, but how does stress affect the way you lead and affect the way that you interact with one another? Do you deal with stress from a healthy standpoint in your own life? Are you self-confident? Not necessarily boastful or certainly not full of ego, but do you have enough confidence to go out and kind of know that you're doing the right thing, know what your why is, know how to communicate that, and put that out into the world? So in a strong correlation between decisions made and sort of available evidence. So we talked about kind of that gut feeling, and that has an important place in the way that we make decisions, but particularly in ending homelessness, we have to look at the evidence. We are always kind of under the gun in terms of figuring out how we put things in certain places. How do we deal with huge, vast geographies? How many staff do we need? How much money do we need? So are you able to look at the evidence of what's going on right now? Do you have good evidence? Do you have good data? And dipping into that, and not just for like the COC-wide standpoint, but are you within your own organization? Are you looking at what you're doing? In comparison to other organizations, in comparison to just where do you want to be yourself? Are you able to pull that and look at it and be able to understand that? So we all have kind of tensions and preferences as a leader. So, and there's different kinds. So controlling leader is looking for strong commitment to outcomes at all costs. They desire to kind of stay ahead of the curve. People are resourced to achieve the desired result, and people can be replaced at any time. That would be a controlling leader. And kind of thinking about where you are on the spectrum. They provide clear direction, but don't always fill others in on kind of the big picture strategies. A supportive leader has a strong commitment to people and the processes, the outcomes, or the product of teamwork, open to a range of opinions and ideas on how to do the work and achieve that result, and can put off or even sacrifice their own priorities for the sake of others on the team. So again, if you recall back, like the responsibility as a leader in terms of, are you able to sacrifice yourself for the good of the team, for the good of the mission, for the good of the vision? And by the way, that's why we call it a vision, a thing that we look at, a thing that we can believe, a thing that's tangible to us. So are you able to do that? Other tensions and preferences as a leader, are you a relaxed leader? Are you intently focused on process more than the actual outputs? Do you have a strong sense of things falling into place in due time, responsive to various inputs from a range of perspectives? And do you look at kind of like some things will get done soon versus kind of a timeline and finite tasks? Are you an urgent leader? Results often at any cost as quickly as possible, can motivate through us and them, set aggressive deadlines and ambitious targets, track progress of achieving results very frequently. Are you that kind of person? Outgoing. Are you an outgoing leader? I'm not. I'm a bit of an introvert, I'll be honest with you, but are you a cheerleader in small or large groups, or see the necessity for kind of positive PR and favorable media profile? Do you attend a lot of meetings and events? Again, I don't. Can you see the work as a brand and to be built and promoted and protected? Are you the introspective leader? Are you, do you reflect? Do you think? Do you tinker within kind of the safe space? The work speaks for itself. So I don't have to go out and talk to a bunch of people at X conference because my work's going to speak for itself. Our outcomes are going to speak for themselves. You consider personal the role in making the results actually happen. Believes that the results speak louder than events, marketing, or any other outward celebration. Are you the exacting leader? Do you have fidelity to the practice, and that's the most important thing to you? It's paramount. You guys do things a certain way, and we adhere to that. Exhaustive and kind of explaining methods and results, rarely a yes or no answer because the context or backstory must be framed properly. Are you data-driven? Often find yourself in the weeds. So if you're this kind of exacting leader, do you get stuck in kind of every little nuance moment of what's going on and end up in the weeds? A generalizing leader looking at the big picture. Do you have sweeping statements to explain processes, approaches, and results? Positions information and data to suit the situation and the needs versus just looking at kind of what things are at the moment, what's the evidence show, which way, what direction do we need to go? And you're frustrated and annoyed by discussion or debate about the minutia, about the stuff. So that would be kind of impatient. I have a little bit of these traits here and really understand how exactly the work is done. So, you know, we're looking at kind of the extremes. I would argue in many cases that you have kind of different people on a team that would fulfill these roles as a leader. If you're looking kind of down the chain in terms of, and we've already talked about how different people can be different types of leaders in that context. And do you have somebody else, if you're lacking kind of in one area, somebody else fulfill those roles? Certainly here at my job, I have those folks. So I'm not terribly exacting. I'm more of a generalist. I'm more of a kind of looking at the big picture, but I need to have people on staff who are more that kind of type A exacting person to quite frankly keep me out of trouble, so I stay on task because it's not as important to me. So having that diversity. 5 elements kind of inform the leader you are: how you make decisions, how you communicate, how you relate to followers, how you respond to and feel about change, and then how you handle pressure. So how sure makes you that you're making the correct decision? So no shortage of decisions need to be made in homelessness. So what intervention do we need? Where to invest the money? How do we get the money? Who do we hire? What strategy do we prioritize? Which partnerships to nourish and which previous relationships to let go of? When it comes to important decisions, for example, staffing, do you reach decisions quickly or decisively, or do you process over quite some time and work through pros and cons? How do you go about this? How do you go about gathering the information that you need? Communication. So you're communicating both internally and externally. The number one issue pointed out in an organization that needs to be fixed is kind of communication. And I would say that here, when we've made mistakes and when things go wrong, at least in our environment, this is largely kind of the culprit. So do you like being the spokesperson or have others be the spokesperson? I do not. I like other people to fill that role. Even though I'm presenting to you guys, I'm much more comfortable in a room full of 200 people during training than I am going to like a press conference, like not my thing. Do you painstakingly work through every possible anticipated question, or are you more like freewheeling? How do the people you work with most closely communicate to you? Is it formal or informal? And how do you most frequently communicate with them? So what kind of relationship do you have kind of both on the exterior of your communications and internally? How do you go about that? A leader is not a leader without followers. That's sort of the definition of leading. To be a leader, you have to have some degree of followers. So do people need to be told that you're in charge? And we brought that up before, or is that an implicit thing? They know that you lead because you kind of lead from the front. Are you leader even though someone else may technically be the boss? So this happens a lot. And I would even argue that in our organizational structure here, we have more than one leader. I may be like the boss and seen as the top of the hierarchy, but I have people here that lead in different functions, lead in different communities, lead in different ideals. They're the kind of the experts in those areas. So when we have big areas and big communities and complex issues, you're going to have that. So even though people may report to you, do they trust you as their leader? If so, how do you know? Have you asked them? You know, when we talk about that circle of safety and how far we're extending it, how many people do you have that feel that they're on the outside of that circle of safety? Are you asking them? Are you communicating with them? Are you literally going and communicating with them? Another one of my big pet peeves, and I brought it up once, but are you shooting an email, or are you having a one-on-one conversation about how people feel about what's going on? Kind of a candid conversation about that. Change. This is the big one. So leaders create, adapt, and lead change. When we talk about change, we're being asked to change the impossible into the possible in ending homelessness. We're facing a crisis in homelessness. And depending on where you are, kind of getting worse or getting better. And yet the most scary word in the sentence is not crisis, it's we. We lets us point fingers at others as if it's their issue or the problem, or we means someone else has to pony up resources to make change happen. We means someone else should deal with uncertainty that staff, boards, elected officials, and people experiencing homelessness feel when there is change afoot. I want to suggest that we need to take apathy straight on. Our strength comes from shared responsibility. This is the one part of the world that, you know, are you more of a caterpillar or a butterfly when it comes to the process of change? Change is painful for a lot of people. Does change energize you, or does it like suck the life out of you? How do your followers react to you when change is happening? And again, this is the interest in the difference in personalities and difference in the way people frame things. You have to be able to navigate through change in such a way to get to the point where we are looking to ultimate goal and adhering to one another's kind of understanding the fears and understanding the motivations of people that you have on staff and out in the community. Sometimes when we change to do kind of the right thing, when you're going to change the way your shelter works, when you're going to change the way your rapid rehousing works, when you're going to embrace new things, you have to be able to communicate why you're doing that, again, correctly, and navigate through that change. And it's going to cause sort of external issues and internal issues. So how do we navigate that change? Pressure. We face internal and external pressures. Are you calm or frazzled publicly? Are you any different behind the scenes or with your followers that you know well? I used to be the kind of frazzled public dude until I don't know, hit middle age, I think, and got to the point of I just am who I am. Kind of one of the more powerful moments from my arc in terms of becoming a leader is that point of figuring out why I do what I do here. And that gave me a lot of foundational strength to not be as frazzled, not worry about decisions, not worry about kind of outside tasks. Sometimes we rise to the challenge of pressure and find it exhilarating, and sometimes we find it exhausting. For me, it depends on the kind of pressure. I find sort of political stuff and nonsense like that exhausting. I find making huge leaps in things like housing a lot of people and keeping a lot of people housed extremely exhilarating. I like kind of the volume of our work and doing it really well. So if you work through kind of pressure situations, do you replay all that happened? Do you examine how you react to that? And that changes a lot over time as you grow and you get better at what you're doing. And you root into things like, why do I do this? It gives you kind of an armor in a way, in terms of rooting into, on any given day, am I more worried about people dying on the street, or am I more worried about what somebody over there thinks of me? And for me, it's kind of an easy decision between those two. So think about how you kind of respond to those 5 elements. How do you respond to the 5 elements? How do you respond to those elements and not anyone else? So hopefully you've gone kind of through your head and thought about, how do I respond to that? Where do I fall in terms of that general continuum of behavior? So the skills of successful leaders. Intelligent, diplomatic, tactful, clear communicator through multiple mediums, conceptually skilled, creative, and this is the big one, persuasive, good at public speaking or passable at public speaking, one or the other. Group dynamics and competing interests, and you can navigate those group dynamics and competing interests. A social person. But the new thinking, where are you looking to anticipate change? How do you understand trends and their impacts? How do you understand kind of the outside world and the environment and how that affects what you're doing as a leader? In which ways are you managing kind of the diversity of people and the opinions? Are you developing relationships with people different from yourself? So we talked about kind of the differences within and the differences without. Are you looking at kind of their standpoint and their viewpoint, which again, I argue is kind of one of our biggest challenges right now as a society? Are you courageous to give a pass, and are you open to reinventing your work? So kind of a buzz phrase around here at the coalition is always say that nothing is sacred. You know, other than the actual work that we're doing, our vision, our mission, nothing else is sacred. I'm not tied to any other thing that we need to do long term if it's not working. Kind of the cliche phrase let's put out there is don't cling onto a mistake that just it's taking you a lot of time to make. Are you able to kind of look back and see, I didn't do well at that, I need to change that? And I think that if you're a good leader, that's dragging a lot of the ugliness of how things are going in your organization, your performance, and where people are out into the light quite a bit, and looking at that, and also being very introspective, in my opinion. So the one thing we don't want to do is look at leadership through comparison or competition. The comparison mandate is crushing. Be like everyone else, but better. You should fit in and stand out. So, you know, when we're working across our morality, we try to do this, and we try to compare and have competition in terms of creating a stimulant for change. And comparison is really the thief of happiness and success. And oddly enough, we've talked a lot about today about happiness, how happiness spills into the overall mode of how we're running organizations and how we're leading them. Comparison and competition is short-lived as a leadership strategy. And when you surpass that, then what? Why can't you be more like Sally? She's doing this and she's doing so much better. It doesn't incentivize people very long term, because it doesn't kind of dovetail into that ideal of safety. So let's look real quick at kind of the 10 dominant leadership styles and how each relates to ending homelessness. And this is pretty interesting, and don't stress kind of taking notes, because you guys will all have this on PDF. So each of the 10 is based upon a century of kind of psychosocial study. And then that typology uses the same foundation as most personality tests and kind of team personality profiles. So as we go through these, don't think that one's right and another is wrong. Chances are you're more like one of these than others, and very unlike one from all the others. Think of your normal, relaxed self to determine which one you're most like. Situations may result in you slipping into different styles. Think about the folks around you. Who are the other kind of leaders? Even if you're the executive director, who's the other leader in your organization that fits into these different styles? And the hope is showing each of these is not just about you better understanding your natural style, but also to appreciate what other leaders in your organization or community may very well have a different style than your own. They contribute something different than you. That diversity is cool. That diversity helps us making good decisions and looking at the world and our problem and ending homelessness in a very holistic way. So how do you work constructively with them rather than expecting them to change their natural style or match up to your own? So I've made that mistake again and again and again with staff and people around me, is trying to, again, ego. Ego is kind of the ultimate enemy in this, and looking at people's different styles and expecting them to be something that they're not. And that's not very realistic, and certainly doesn't work with kind of our ideal of human nature. So let's go through these real quick. So the transactional leadership style, it's team members agree to follow the leader punishes those who don't meet the standard. It's this focus on short-term tasks. Clear roles and responsibilities are defined. And it's most helpful when ending homelessness in terms of adopting to a new method or service delivery, method of service delivery, and new expectations for funding and reporting. Least helpful when ending homelessness if we're learning how to figure out how to innovate and exercise discretion. Longer term or multi-year projects doesn't fit so well, and when the strategic vision is required. So I often clashes with servant leaders, charismatic leaders, transformative leaders, participant leaders, and laissez-faire leaders, which we're all going to cover here real quick. The autocratic leadership style. So this is kind of the military style because of the hierarchy and the command and control. I would argue that it's kind of a blanket statement because I think there can be a lot of creativity, which shows you where I might run into the style matrix. The leaders exercise power of the others and they make quick decisions for others to follow. That's most helpful when we have a crisis or an unexpected situation, changing the culture from participative to ineffective to having clear expectations, and when there is a lack of policy. So again, you may morph in and out of these different styles, so keep that in mind as we go through. You may not be just one thing. The least helpful for the autocratic style and ending homelessness is when there are already high-performing organizations, when the expectation of the leader is not aligned with the proven practice, and if following does not result in the reward. So it clashes with kind of relationship leaders, participative leaders, laissez-faire leaders, and servant leaders. So this is, again, it goes back kind of the first style I'm looking at, having this tight chain of command, making quick decisions, and expecting everybody's going to follow those. But good for crisis. Servant leader. Traits of a servant leader are full of integrity. They're very ethical. They lead kind of from behind. They're not they would be more kind of the introvert leader. They're behind the scenes. They heap praise on others without taking the credit themselves. And they see things from what happens out there. They see things from the perspective of people with lived experience and how well are we doing in terms of ending homelessness from that standpoint. They're most helpful when we're ending homelessness because frontline buying is critical to success, and when community and organizations have experienced kind of change fatigue. So going through a lot of different changes and people don't deal with that well, and then heaping that praise and making sure people know that they're valued to get through that change. Or if the services have been punitive or exclusive in their orientation. So it's least helpful when there's sort of a lack of existing accountability and infrastructure. They don't extend the virtue of a service to the end users, and a checklist approach to kind of plan implementation. And you'll see where these kind of clash with the other styles. I would say probably for myself that I fit a little bit into this one sometimes. Another style is a relationship oriented, so they make themselves available to others naturally. And we talked about the importance of kind of reaching out. These folks do that automatically. Can people above the task completion and focus on the coaching and the development of others. So not just if you're not getting it done, out the door you go. It's most helpful when you got young staff teams or inexperienced organizations kind of implementing programs. This is kind of where the mentorship comes in. These folks like to mentor people, make sure that they understand what's going on and they're very patient. Helpful when there's a murky political landscape or organizations and people are terrified of change. This is a very nurturing type leader type style. Least helpful when we need to hit those hard deadlines or existing strong leaders across multiple organizations already bought into the task. So clashes with kind of your more autocratic type A task-oriented folks because it's more relational in nature. The task-oriented person. I'm not this person, but I have somebody on staff who is, and can't tell you enough how useful that is, especially for a disorganized dude like me. So they've got that checklist mentality. They create and maintain the standards and the project plans and get done. They're a doer. So they're looking at what needs to be done on what timeline and getting it done. Insist on the measurement of the productivity, and they're motivated through the actual task completion. They're the ones that get that hit of serotonin when we check off the task on the to-do box. So they're wired that way. They're most helpful when you have a lack of infrastructure and you need sort of a template of how we function and you need structure. Most helpful when there are many events, many things moving at one time. This week has been one of those weeks for us, so I'm glad I have one of these folks on staff, or when there's sort of inconsistencies, lack of standards, inconsistent stuff. Least helpful when people need coaching and need to learn how to complete tasks because they don't have the patience necessarily for that. They just want to get it done. Or when there are competing visions of how to implement projects. So a transformational leader, that's kind of your inspired person. They're the inspired change agents. They're the innovators. They're the people that adopt the crazy stuff at the outset and test it out and either scrap it or move on. They have high demands on themselves and their team, and they want them to be productive and accountable, and they gauge others in the process and results. So they're not kind of an in-house type person. They focus on the big picture, and they don't like the small details. They're not like kind of the last style we had, the target of mistrust of other established kind of people and organizations, because they're always out in the front. And you guys may recognize this in yourself. You may be a vanguard in your community, and from personal experience, I'll tell you, end up getting beat up a lot that way, but I've definitely fallen into kind of this category to a degree, although it feels a little egotistical to call myself transformational. Most helpful in ending homelessness when the status quo is just not working. We're going to move on to the next thing, when we need to rethink of why a community organization is doing what it's doing when there's low energy, when homelessness is not even on the radar in some communities. Like, this is the person you want to come in and like get people fired up about it. Least helpful when the leader becomes the focus, not the work or the issue itself. And there's a big danger in that, in terms of like, are you becoming the cult of personality? Are you the one that people are looking at in terms of solving the problem versus focusing on the issue in the problem itself? Becomes with us or against us in their kind of transformation journey. And I've been guilty of that. And others fear sharing their ideas or innovations. So that's your transformational leader. Almost done, bear with me. Charismatic. So this is your rah-rah trick leader. This is your energetic person. They're vocally motivating, celebratory, kind of us versus them sometimes. I have one of these folks on staff, and you guys probably know that person in terms of within your own organization. They're kind of a positive vibe. Most helpful when ending homelessness if organizations are harmlessly competitive, or great staff organizations have been underperforming, or results have gone unnoticed. They're the ones that are going to say, you know, the other day, my person who's the charismatic leader here, they came to me and said, we really need to pay attention to how long people have been here and when their anniversary date is. And we need to do something, you need to do something to like call that out and like treat them, make like a special effort to reach out to them one-on-one. And she was totally right and was totally not on my radar. So another good example of how, you know, those diverse strategies and personalities can really be a boon to your organization, because it's going to fulfill parts of it maybe you can't. And that was a good example where I just wasn't in that headspace and she was, and that's super helpful. That helps complement what I don't do or don't think about. Bureaucratic, we know these folks, they want to enforce the rules written or informed by others by the book. They want to seek policy or legislative guidelines for action or for a reason or inaction, and beholden to others. They're risk adverse. This is, you know, bureaucratic mindset. This is not where innovation is going to happen, because they're not going to take risks. They're worried about, you know, when you hear the word liability more than 12 times in a meeting, that's those folks. Or they want to, you know, go to meetings and hearings, and they're most helpful when you have a highly litigious environment, which actually we sort of do here in West Virginia to some degree, or the community is polarized by advocates, or there's a history of fund or program mismanagement or things going wrong, or we're seeking compliance with new rules or guidelines, or following a plan to a T. They're not great at innovation, as we mentioned. They're not great when the community-based sector is leading the change, or when the legislative process takes too long. So they're the by the processes, by the rules, folks. Laissez-faire leader. Provides complete freedom to team and sets priorities, establish work plans, innovate, etc. So they'll let them have that kind of the ultimate and decentralized command. They work in an advisor capacity to the team when requested, tries to breed personal autonomy for work and results. So, you know, putting the trust in people to go out there and do their thing. In our world, when we're ending homelessness, they're most helpful when there's a established and high functioning service delivery system, or an organization that kind of has all the policies in place and everything that needs to be there in terms of the infrastructure. That work's already been done, not necessarily by them. If there's high functioning kind of self-guided teams within that organization, and then laissez-faire leader fits right into the mold, or results are consistently positive. So they're not that helpful when there are any underperforming parts of the service delivery system, or you have inexperienced service providers, or targets are not being achieved consistently. So the last one is our participative. So they include many voices and opinions in establishing an agenda and making decisions, many meetings and committees, and very inclusive of the hopes of increased buy-in. They're most helpful when there's sort of ideological divides across the service providers and the staff, and the overall scope of the issue is small, and there's sort of a history of collaboration because some of the buy-ins there already. It's helpful when we have an urgency or the scope is too large, or the service provider staff would rather someone told them exactly what is expected, or there's not a declared or preferred approach or intervention. So again, these are things that we'll send out that you can review in terms of like, where do you fit into that spectrum, or who on your staff fits into those different spectrums, and how do they complement one another? What kind of style more appeals to you? And when I look at it, I see kind of changes that I want to make in some of my style. And actually going through the presentation, it's figuring out kind of what is your most natural style, what is your most unnatural style, what style do you have some most conflict with, and can you mentally prepare for that, and kind of what is your emotional style. So as we head kind of into the home stretch here, we need to understand and have awareness of our general vulnerabilities. So some fatal flaws of leaders, and we have to own these and call them out. And if you're very introspective and you're doing this a lot, a fatal flaw would be kind of emotional fragility. You're unable to handle stress. You have outbursts. You have kind of ongoing instability, moodiness, and anger. And this is if it's becoming kind of a chronic thing. I think we all kind of go through this at some point, but when it's a chronic thing, and that's how sort of you frame your leadership style. Another fatal flaw is kind of overconfidence and arrogance. So you don't take advice, you don't take input from everybody else. You have this feeling of infallibility and I can do anything else. And ego is at the front. We talked a lot about checking that ego. Or if you have a lack of integrity, if you're dishonest through lies or omission, or you don't have moral principles as a foundation for decision making, and you're worried about your self-interest or not the overall vision and the why and the mission of what we want to try to achieve. So a little bit of kind of my downfalls is, anger doesn't solve much of anything. You need to be open. You need to think about the different styles of people and how we're communicating. So another fatal flaw would be defensiveness. So lack of openness to correction or covering up mistakes, blaming others, and whining. That's the opposite of taking that extreme ownership that we talked about in the outset. So also poor interpersonal skills. So you don't communicate clearly or frequently verbally or in writing. You address conflict through emotion, or you fail to acknowledge the contributions of others. So you're not listening. You're just waiting to talk all the time. Say please once in a while. Be nice. Or you're being polite to folks. Again, that sense of belonging and that sense, that circle of safety, that can come from a lot of interesting places. And this is the ability to have those good interpersonal skills. So with leadership comes power, like Spider-Man. Make others feel powerful. Give authority to others. Again, if you've been a good gatekeeper at the front, then you should be okay with giving the reins for some of your stuff to somebody else and not just taking it all on your own. Expose the frailties of what's going on, but never whine. Ugly leaders pretend they have it all figured out. I really try not to be that guy because I don't have it all figured out. Bring up awkward issues with optimism. Assume that you talk too much. Listen at least 60% of the time. Or Simon Sinek has a great quote that somebody said to him. I was reading a book, and when he was a young leader, they said it was a presentation, he was answering all the questions, he was standing in the room, and his supervisor said to him afterwards, hey, 3/4 of an answer is better than 1.5 answers. So this ability to be quiet, listen, not just wait for your turn to talk, but really like actively listen to people and let them give you their input. Take action after you're listening. The more you get done, the better you lead. I think sometimes we think that when we become leaders that our workload actually kind of goes down when really it goes up. Not necessarily in terms of tasks and being in the weeds, but now when we go back to what I talked before, you're at the helm of making sure that you are ready to deal with the issues, and you're sacrificing yourself and being a servant to others in terms of what comes down the pipe. And that increased the trust and the safety. The unexamined leader is not worth following. And I don't mean from the outside, but I mean from the inside. I think you guys have to take some time. I know that I do, and it's hard in this world when we're as busy as we are, but you have to take moments and have a little self-reflection in terms of why we do this. What am I doing? Am I taking an honest, do I have an honest assessment of myself and how I've been acting, how I've been leading, and how I go about this? You know, if you have coworkers that you need to have like a long overdue heart-to-heart talk about some of the ways you behave or things you've done, you know, take the time to do that, make the time to do that, preferably in person. Be authentic. Cultivate courage to be imperfect, set boundaries, and be vulnerable. Again, nothing squashes and kills innovation like expecting everybody's going to be perfect all the time and not allowing people to make mistakes. You don't want people to intentionally make mistakes, but you want people to try things and fail and refine and go back. Exercise compassion that comes from realizing and accepting we're all made from strengths and struggles. No one's perfect, not you, not your staff, not whoever's going to come on next. We want to nurture that connection, that sense of belonging that can only happen when we believe we're good enough to do this, and everybody around us is good enough to do this, and then we spread that circle of safety out. Invite grace, joy, and gratitude into your life. Don't just deal with tasks. You know, occasionally also give yourself a little bit of pat on the back in terms of we're dealing with a complex and hard issue, as are your staff. You know, we take things home. You know, we see sometimes kind of the worst ends of humanity sometimes, unfortunately. And we got to be authentic and vulnerable and own that and be okay about it and be okay with talking to your staff about kind of what you're feeling about where we're going. Again, they're rooted into your why. They're going to believe in you. They're going to believe in what overall we're doing. The problem with perfectionism, when we try to be perfect, which I just stopped trying to be perfect a long time ago, there's no such thing as perfect. That's constantly changing. That's not a static concept. It's not the same thing as kind of striving to be your best. Giving yourself the permission to go and screw up, giving your staff the permission to go and screw up and come back to the table. Perfectionism is not sort of self-improvement. It's striving towards something that's probably never ever going to happen. And paralysis comes from missed opportunities because we're too afraid to put anything in the world that could be imperfect. So I think we make this mistake in our world a lot in terms of trying to get something on paper that's going to make sense, and we want the process to work this way, and then we get to the end of it and we realize that on the ground that didn't work on paper because we're too afraid to kind of everything had to be laid out, perfected. You know, imperfect action is far more valuable than waiting and waiting and waiting for everything to be perfect. So perfection contaminates because it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It touches everyone around us. And the quest itself of perfection kind of makes our lives suffocating to others, and our attitude suffocates others or runs the risk of that. So the couple of the resources, and I brought them up during the presentation. You know, Simon Sinek's Start With Why and Leaders Eat Last. A lot of the material in here came from those, and they're awesome. I encourage you to read them. Simon Sinek, if you Google him or look him up on YouTube, you'll find a lot of good stuff from a long time ago and up to today. Jocko Willink and Lee Babin, Extreme Ownership. Again, if you'd like that, if you're sort of a closet military historian like I am, or you just want to understand the juxtaposition of kind of how leadership is done in the military and how that affects kind of the wider business world. One also, and I didn't talk about this much, but there's a book by Sebastian Junger, the guy who wrote The Perfect Storm, if you've seen the movie, called Tribe, out not so long ago. And it's been really helpful to me, and maybe not the kind of book that everyone likes, but I really enjoy it. And it's been helpful to me in sort of framing my leadership style and understanding a little bit of what's kind of going on in the world right now. So with that, I want to thank you guys so much for paying attention and taking the time. And I'm ready to take any sort of questions that came up in the chat box or address anything now. Craig, did we get any questions? I see 0 questions.
I've been watching. You've been doing pretty good.
Okay. So no questions. Wow. Okay. Well, guys, thank you. Like I said, if you have any if we don't have questions now, if you have questions kind of after the fact, feel free to hit me up on Twitter. Feel free to send me an email. Again, it's zbrown@orgcode.com. Please do check out OrgCode's website, particularly Ian's blogs. If you want to look at some of the blogs that I've written, you can check out our just Google West Virginia Coalition and Homelessness. And on there, I put most of our blogs. So thank you guys so much for the time. I hope it's been helpful. And I can't wait to get back to Texas and do some work again sometime. So everybody take care. Have a great day.
You too, Zach. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And again, for everybody else, we were recording this. I will be sending out a link to the recording as well as all materials going over today. If you have any questions, all of our contact information